In the winter of 1854, in Bourbon County, Kentucky, something happened that shattered the illusion of domestic tranquility that wealthy families worked so hard to maintain. A woman named Aiah, a family who trusted her completely with their most intimate possessions, and a calculated poisoning that unfolded over months, so subtle that nobody suspected until 3 people were dead and 2 more were dying. If stories about hidden warfare matter to you, about how enslaved people fought back using patience and access rather than open violence, then stay with me. Because what Aiah did between 1853 and 1854 tells you everything you need to know about invisible resistance, about trust weaponized, and about how the people closest to power can be the most dangerous. The year 1853 sits in a complicated period for Kentucky slavery. Unlike the Deep South, Kentucky wasn't primarily a cotton state. The economy was more diversified: tobacco, hemp, livestock, and increasingly, the domestic slave trade itself. Kentucky had become a major supplier of enslaved people to the expanding cotton frontier, tearing apart families for profit while maintaining a veneer of being a more civilized form of slavery than what existed further south. Aiah was born around 1825 on a farm in central Kentucky. By 1853, she was 28 years old and had already been owned by 4 different families. She'd been trained as a seamstress from childhood, a valuable skill that made her worth more at auction than field workers. Aiah could sew anything. She could make elaborate dresses from patterns, alter garments to fit perfectly, embroider intricate designs, create clothing that wealthy families needed to maintain their social status. These skills made her valuable. They also gave her access to wealthy households in ways that field workers never had. In March 1853, Aiah was purchased by the Caldwell family. James Caldwell owned Fairview Estate, 200 acres outside Paris, Kentucky, 40 enslaved people, profitable tobacco production. But what really mattered to the Caldwells was their social standing. James was involved in state politics. His wife Eleanor came from old Virginia money. They had 3 children and maintained one of the finest homes in Bourbon County. The Caldwells needed a seamstress who could create the elaborate clothing their social position required. Aiah came highly recommended by the dealer who sold her. Skilled, reliable, experienced in working for wealthy families. Aiah arrived at Fairview in early April 1853. She was given a small room adjacent to the main house where she would work, a space filled with fabrics, threads, patterns, and the tools of her trade. She would be responsible for all the family's clothing needs, from everyday garments to elaborate party dresses for Eleanor and the children. For the first few weeks, Aiah learned the family's preferences and routines. James Caldwell was 45 years old, focused on his business and political interests, largely uninvolved in household management. Eleanor was 38, the real power in the household, managing everything from the enslaved staff to social obligations. The children were Margaret, age 14, Thomas, age 11, and Catherine, age 8. They'd been raised with the casual entitlement that came from never questioning their privilege, never thinking deeply about the system that provided their comfort. Aiah observed all of them carefully, watched how they treated her and the other enslaved people at Fairview, listened to how they talked about enslaved people when they thought nobody was listening, understood exactly what they thought of people like her. What sealed the Caldwell family's fate happened about 6 weeks after Aiah arrived. An enslaved woman named Hannah, who worked in the fields, was discovered trying to run away. She was caught within a day. There was nowhere to run in Kentucky, no easy path to freedom, no realistic hope of reaching free territory without help. James Caldwell had Hannah brought to the yard in front of the main house. He had her whipped in view of all the enslaved people at Fairview, 30 lashes that tore her back apart. Then he had her sold immediately to a trader heading to Mississippi, separating her from her 2 young children who remained at Fairview. Aiah watched this from the window of her sewing room, watched Hannah being beaten for wanting freedom, watched her being sold away from her children, watched the children screaming for their mother as she was taken away in chains. That night, Aiah made her decision. The Caldwell family would pay for what they'd done to Hannah. Not immediately, that would be too obvious. But slowly, carefully, using the access and trust her position provided. Aiah would poison them. Not quickly enough to be obvious, but slowly enough that it would look like illness. She would use her position as seamstress, someone who handled their most intimate possessions, who had access to their bedrooms and clothing, to deliver poison in ways they'd never suspect. The plan took shape over several weeks. Aiah had advantages that made it possible. She could read. Someone had taught her years ago, despite it being illegal. She had access to the Caldwell Library and could study medical books when the family was away. She had freedom of movement through the house that field workers never had. Most importantly, she had intimate access to the family's possessions. She handled their clothing, their bedding, their personal items. She could adulterate these items with poison, and nobody would suspect the quiet seamstress who seemed so devoted to her work. Aiah began researching toxins that could be absorbed through skin. What she learned was that certain substances didn't need to be ingested to cause harm. They could be absorbed through prolonged skin contact, causing cumulative damage that looked like various illnesses. She focused on mercury compounds. Mercury was available. It was used in medicine, in certain dyes, in treatments for various conditions. In small amounts absorbed through skin over time, it caused symptoms that looked like neurological disease, tremors, confusion, mood changes, kidney damage. The genius of Aiah's plan was its subtlety. She wouldn't poison food or drink, which would be too easily connected to kitchen staff. She would poison clothing and bedding, items she was responsible for maintaining, items that had prolonged contact with the Caldwell's skin. In June 1853, Aiah began her campaign. She started with James Caldwell's nightshirts. She prepared a solution with mercury compounds dissolved in liquid that would be absorbed into fabric. When the fabric dried, it looked and felt normal, but it contained poison that would be absorbed through James's skin during the 8 hours he wore the nightshirt. The dosing was incredibly subtle. Each nightshirt contained only a tiny amount of mercury. But James wore nightshirts every night, and Aiah was responsible for laundering and maintaining them, which meant she could retreat them regularly. After 2 months, James started experiencing symptoms. Fatigue at first, then mild tremors in his hands. He complained to Eleanor about not feeling quite right, but nothing specific, nothing obviously wrong. Doctors were consulted. They examined James and found nothing particularly alarming. The tremors were mild, possibly due to stress or overwork. They prescribed rest and tonics, neither of which would help since the problem was poison being absorbed nightly through his nightshirt. Encouraged by this success, Aiah expanded her operation. She began treating Eleanor's nightgowns with the same mercury solution, then the children's nightclothes. She was methodical, patient, never adding so much poison that symptoms would develop quickly enough to trigger investigation. The Caldwell family members began developing similar symptoms over the following months: fatigue, mild tremors, occasional confusion, unexplained mood changes. The doctors were puzzled. It seemed like some kind of familial illness, perhaps something environmental affecting the whole household. But it wasn't environmental except in the most specific sense. Their clothing was poisoning them. The nightclothes they trusted, maintained by the enslaved seamstress they'd never thought to suspect. Aiah continued her work through the summer and fall of 1853. She sewed elaborate dresses and suits during the day, maintaining the appearance of a devoted servant. At night, she treated nightclothes with mercury, ensuring the Caldwells continued absorbing poison in their sleep. The symptoms worsened gradually. James's tremors became more pronounced. Eleanor developed kidney problems. The children were losing weight, seemed listless and unwell. Multiple doctors examined the family. They diagnosed various conditions: neurological disease for James, kidney ailment for Eleanor, constitutional weakness in the children. They prescribed treatments, all of which failed because the diagnosis was wrong. The real problem was slow mercury poisoning from their nightclothes. By December 1853, the family was seriously ill. James could barely work. His tremors made writing difficult, and he was increasingly confused. Eleanor was bedridden much of the time, her kidneys failing. The children were weak, struggling with basic activities. The Caldwell extended family became involved. James's brother came from Lexington to help manage the estate. Eleanor's parents arrived from Virginia, deeply concerned about their daughter's health. Aiah watched all of this with grim satisfaction. The family that had tortured Hannah and sold her away from her children was now suffering, confused about why their bodies were betraying them. And nobody suspected the quiet seamstress who continued faithfully maintaining their clothing. In January 1854, young Catherine Caldwell died. She was 8 years old, her small body unable to withstand the accumulated mercury poisoning. The doctors attributed her death to constitutional weakness, perhaps complicated by the mysterious family illness. The funeral was held at Fairview. Aiah attended along with the other household slaves, her face appropriately somber. Inside, she felt conflicted. She hadn't particularly wanted to kill a child, but Catherine was part of the family that perpetuated slavery, that would have grown up to own people, just as her parents did. Catherine's death didn't stop Aiah. If anything, it confirmed that her method was working. The Caldwells were dying slowly, and nobody had connected it to the nightclothes Aiah maintained. By March 1854, James Caldwell's condition had deteriorated severely. His tremors were constant. He was mentally confused much of the time. His kidneys were failing. He died on March 18, 1854, officially from kidney disease complicated by neurological decline. His funeral was larger than Catherine's. James was an important man, and many prominent Kentucky families attended. Everyone spoke about the tragedy of the mysterious illness that had taken him and his daughter. Nobody suspected it wasn't illness at all. Eleanor Caldwell was next. She'd been deteriorating more slowly than James, but by April 1854, she was clearly dying. Her kidneys had failed. She was in constant pain. She barely recognized her remaining children. She died on April 29th, 1854. The doctors were completely baffled, an entire family being destroyed by some mysterious ailment. They discussed whether it might be something in the house itself, some environmental toxin that affected everyone. They were right that it was environmental, but they never thought to test the clothing and bedding that Aiah maintained. After Eleanor's death, James's brother took custody of the 2 surviving children, Margaret and Thomas. He moved them to his home in Lexington, away from Fairview, and whatever mysterious illness had killed their parents and sister. The move probably saved their lives. Away from Aiah's poisoned nightclothes, they slowly began to recover. The tremors faded. Their energy returned. Within 6 months, they seemed relatively healthy, though they'd suffered permanent damage from the mercury exposure. Meanwhile, James's brother faced the question of what to do with Fairview Estate. He decided to sell it, including most of the enslaved people who worked there. The property was liquidated over the summer of 1854. Aiah was sold in July 1854 to a family in Lexington. She'd successfully poisoned 3 members of the Caldwell family to death and permanently damaged 2 others, and nobody suspected her at all. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if Aiah hadn't made one critical mistake. Her new owners in Lexington were the Peterson family. They purchased Aiah specifically for her seamstress skills, having heard she'd worked for the prominent Caldwell family. Aiah arrived at the Peterson household in August 1854 and immediately began assessing the situation. The Petersons seemed similar to the Caldwells, wealthy, entitled, treating enslaved people as property without much thought to their humanity. But there was one difference. The Peterson family included a trained physician. Dr. Marcus Peterson was James Peterson's brother, and he lived in the household while establishing his medical practice. About 6 weeks after Aiah arrived, Dr. Peterson happened to examine some nightshirts Aiah had just laundered. He was looking for a specific garment and noticed something odd: a slight discoloration in the fabric, a residue that seemed unusual. Being a physician and naturally curious, Dr. Peterson tested the residue. What he found shocked him: mercury compounds in concentrations that would be absorbed through skin during prolonged wear. Dr. Peterson immediately thought of the Caldwell family. He'd been one of the doctors who'd examined them, had been baffled by their mysterious illness. The symptoms they'd shown, tremors, kidney failure, neurological problems, were all consistent with chronic mercury poisoning. He checked other nightclothes in the household, found the same mercury residue, realized that someone was deliberately poisoning his family's nightclothes. The only person who had access to prepare and maintain the nightclothes was Aiah. Dr. Peterson confronted Aiah directly. At first, she denied everything, but when presented with the evidence, the mercury in the fabric, the connection to the Caldwell deaths, she understood denial was pointless. "Did you poison the Caldwells?" Dr. Peterson asked. Aiah looked at him steadily. She could lie, could try to escape accountability, or she could own what she'd done. "Yes," she said finally. "I poisoned them. Used mercury in their nightclothes. Killed Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Caldwell, and little Catherine. Would have killed the other 2 if they hadn't been moved away." Dr. Peterson stared at her. "Why? Why would you do something so monstrous?" "Because they were monstrous. Because Mr. Caldwell had Hannah whipped and sold away from her children for trying to be free. Because they treated us like we weren't human. Because somebody had to make them pay." "So you poisoned children? Killed an 8-year-old girl?" "That girl would have grown up to own slaves like her parents did. I stopped her before she could cause the suffering they caused." Dr. Peterson called the authorities immediately. Aiah was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial began in October 1854. It was sensational. Newspapers across Kentucky and beyond covered the story of the enslaved seamstress who'd poisoned her owners through their nightclothes. The prosecution's case was strong. Dr. Peterson testified about finding mercury in the nightclothes, about how the symptoms matched mercury poisoning. Other medical experts confirmed that chronic skin exposure to mercury would cause exactly the symptoms the Caldwells had experienced. Aiah's court-appointed lawyer tried to argue that she'd been acting under extreme duress, that slavery itself had driven her to desperate acts. But Aiah herself undermined this defense. "I wasn't driven to desperation," she told the court. I made a calculated choice, planned it for months, did it deliberately because I wanted them to suffer, to die slowly, to experience helplessness like Hannah experienced when she was beaten and sold away from her children. The prosecutor asked if she felt any remorse for killing Catherine, an 8-year-old child. That child was part of a system that destroys children every day, Aiah replied. Enslaved children are sold away from their mothers, worked to death in fields, beaten for learning to read. Catherine Caldwell's death is tragic. What about all the enslaved children whose deaths nobody mourns? The courtroom was silent. Even people who supported slavery were disturbed by Aiah's cold logic, her refusal to show remorse, her willingness to justify killing a child. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of murder. The judge sentenced Aiah to death by hanging. Aiah accepted the sentence without emotion. She'd known from the moment she started poisoning the Caldwells that if caught, she would die. The only question was whether her revenge had been worth it. Looking back at the 10 months of slowly destroying the Caldwell family, yes, it had been worth it. The execution was scheduled for December 10th, 1854. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Aiah became a controversial figure. Abolitionists used her case to highlight slavery's brutality. Slave owners saw her as evidence that enslaved people needed stricter control. The enslaved community in Kentucky was terrified. They worried that Aiah's actions would lead to collective punishment, that all enslaved people would face increased surveillance and harsher treatment. Their fears proved justified. After Aiah's conviction, Kentucky plantation owners became paranoid about household servants. Some stopped employing enslaved people in intimate household positions. Others instituted strict controls over who handled clothing and bedding. The morning of the execution, December 10th, thousands came to watch. The crowd included plantation owners who wanted to see justice done, enslaved people who were forced to witness as a warning, and curious onlookers who'd followed the sensational trial. Aiah was brought out at noon. She was 29 years old, had spent her entire life enslaved, would die enslaved. She walked to the gallows with steady steps, showing no fear. The executioner asked for final words. "I killed 3 people," Aiah said clearly, "poisoned them slowly using mercury in their nightclothes. It took months, but I was patient. I watched them sicken and die, confused about why their bodies were failing." She paused, looking at the massive crowd. "I did it because James Caldwell had Hannah beaten and sold away from her children, because the Caldwell family represented everything evil about slavery. The casual cruelty, the treating humans as property, the destroying families for profit. I used the access they gave me as their seamstress to destroy them. The clothing they trusted me to maintain became the weapon I used to kill them. Their most intimate possessions, poisoned by the person they never thought to suspect. Yes, I killed a child. Catherine Caldwell was 8 years old, and I poisoned her knowing she would die. I'm not going to pretend I feel good about that. But that child would have grown up in a system that kills enslaved children every day, without anyone caring. I'm not asking for your sympathy or understanding. I'm just telling you what happened and why. Slavery created me. Slavery drove me to do what I did. And if you want to prevent more people like me, you need to end slavery, not execute me. But you won't end it, so there will be more people like me. More enslaved people who use the access you give them, as cooks, as seamstresses, as nurses, to hurt the people who hurt them." The executioner placed the noose around Aiah's neck. She stood straight, looking at the crowd without flinching. They pulled the lever. Aiah dropped. Her neck broke cleanly. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some felt justice had been served. Others were disturbed by what they'd witnessed. Many enslaved people in the crowd felt grief and pride simultaneously. Grief for another life taken by slavery. Pride that someone had struck back so effectively. In the weeks and months after Aiah's execution, her story spread across the South. Plantation owners became more careful about household servants, more suspicious of the people they trusted, with intimate access to their families. Some owners stopped using enslaved seamstresses, preferring to hire free white women or send clothing to professional tailors. Others instituted elaborate precautions, having clothing tested, rotating who handled different tasks, increasing supervision of household workers. The paranoia lasted for years. The idea that clothing and bedding could be weaponized, that poison could be delivered through prolonged skin contact rather than food or drink, terrified wealthy families who depended on enslaved labor for their domestic comfort. Medical professionals studied Aiah's methods. Her use of mercury absorbed through fabric became a case study in toxicology. Doctors wrote papers about chronic dermal mercury exposure, about symptoms that could be mistaken for other conditions, about detection methods. But in enslaved communities, Aiah's story took on different meaning. She became another example of hidden resistance, proof that enslaved people could fight back using intelligence and access rather than open rebellion. Songs emerged, though carefully coded to avoid punishment. The seamstress sewed by candlelight, stitched in secrets through the night. What she wove in cloth so fine brought the master's end in time. Historians have wrestled with Aiah's legacy. She committed premeditated murder of 3 people, including a child. She showed no remorse. She defended her actions even knowing she would die for them. But she did it after witnessing extreme cruelty, after watching Hannah be beaten and separated from her children, after existing in a system that denied her humanity while demanding her labor. The question remains, was Aiah a murderer who deserves only condemnation, or a resistance fighter who used the limited tools available to strike back at oppression? Can we condemn her killing of Catherine while acknowledging that enslaved children faced violence and death regularly without anyone being held accountable? What's clear is the sophistication of her method. Aiah identified a vulnerability in the system, the intimate access that household servants had to their owners' possessions. She researched toxicology, identified substances that could be absorbed through skin, developed a dosing regimen subtle enough to avoid detection for months. She demonstrated remarkable patience and intelligence, qualities that slavery claimed enslaved people didn't possess, but couldn't actually destroy. The story of Aiah forces uncomfortable questions. If you're enslaved with no legal recourse against cruelty, what forms of resistance are morally justifiable? If the system enables violence against you, does that justify violence in return? If children in the enslaving class will grow up to perpetuate slavery, does preventing that future justify their deaths now? These questions don't have comfortable answers. What happened to Aiah, and what Aiah did, exist in a moral space that challenges our frameworks for judgment. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1854, in Kentucky, involving a seamstress who used her skills and access to poison the family that owned her. Remember that it started because that family tortured and separated an enslaved woman from her children. Remember that Aiah responded with calculated patient murder that took months to unfold. Remember that 3 people died, including a child. Remember that Aiah showed no remorse, defended her actions, died, insisting she'd been justified. Remember that this is part of slavery's legacy, not just the obvious violence, but the hidden warfare fought by people who had no power except what they could take through intelligence and opportunity. The seamstress who poisoned the Big House family. It's a story about hidden resistance, about patience as a weapon, about how the people closest to power can be the most dangerous when they decide the cost of revenge is worth paying. It's part of our history, uncomfortable, disturbing, challenging our desire for simple, moral categories. Remember it, all of it. What do you think about Aiah's actions? Was she justified in poisoning the Caldwell family after witnessing their cruelty to Hannah? Does prolonged exposure to slavery's violence excuse calculated murder? Most troublingly, can we make any moral defense of killing 8-year-old Catherine? Or does that act place Aiah beyond justification, regardless of what she'd experienced? These questions have no easy answers. Aiah committed premeditated murder over months, using sophisticated knowledge and remarkable patience. She killed 3 people, including a child. But she did it within a system that gave her no legal recourse against cruelty, that treated her as property, that had normalized violence against people like her. Was chronic mercury poisoning through clothing more or less cruel than the violence slavery inflicted daily? Was Aiah's 10 months of patient poisoning qualitatively different from the lifetime of slow destruction that slavery represented? How do we weigh individual murders against systematic violence? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives that resist simple, moral categorization. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, acknowledging that the past contains situations modern moral frameworks struggle to address, and preserving narratives that reveal how slavery produced violence from multiple directions. Aiah's story forces us to confront how enslaved people used intimate access as a weapon, how patience could be more deadly than passion, and how resistance took forms that make us deeply uncomfortable. See you in the next video.